Welcome back everyone, this is the second episode of my Herp Better video series. In this episode I'm going to be elaborating a bit more on a topic that I touched on in the last video, and that's going to be painting and disguising artificial cover. So in this episode I'm going to be going over the design aspect of this, so why I'm painting things the way I am, the tools that I use, as well as why I think you should be painting your artificial cover. So before we start talking about the design aspect and the different tools that I use, let's just talk about why you should be doing this. And one reason is simply it increases the longevity of the cover that you're setting out. For boards, you're going to be able to prevent some of the weathering that will occur, as well as with tin, you're going to help slow down the rate of rusting by adding a layer of protection on top of it. The main reason that I do this is so that I can disguise my boards and tin from satellite images. So if I'm going to go through all of this work to set up a site, find the tin, find the boards, take them out there, set them in the right spot, clear out the ground, I don't want just anybody going out to it. And it's really easy to find these things on Google Maps if you haven't painted your cover items. And as an example, I just spent about 30 minutes looking on Google Maps on the West Coast in some areas that I know are very popular for king snakes, and I tried to see, well, how easy is it for me to just find some board lines over there? I don't have any intentions of going to the West Coast anytime soon to go do any of this stuff, but if I did, this is what I would do. I would go and look for stuff to find, to turn over and look for snakes, and it was incredibly easy to find some board lines. I found several of them, and I'm going to give a couple of examples of those right now. Let's pull up our first example. So this is a screenshot from Google Maps. This is an image from somewhere along the West Coast. If this is your board line, I apologize for putting it on blast like this, but it was very, very easy to find. It looks, in fact, like somebody's actually, the plywood looks so new, it looks like somebody might have actually just gone and bought this and then cut it up and set it out here. But what really makes it stick out is simply the fact that it's totally unpainted, it's bright, it sticks out from the substrate, and the shape of the boards make them very easy to find. So it didn't really require a whole lot of effort scanning Google Maps in order to find this, because I kind of had an idea of where to look for these things, and this was really easy to find within about 5 minutes, okay? So let's get that image out of the way. I'm going to give you another example, and this board line has less distinct looking boards. They appear to be a little bit more weathered. Let's go ahead and get that image on the screen. Okay, so if you can see those, if you can't, I'm going to highlight those in just a minute, but what really makes these stick out to me is simply their shape. So again, these were next to a walking trail, and they were easy to see because of the shape of the boards, not their coloration. Whereas in that last image, everything was colored really brightly, and it made it stick out really easy and drew my eye to it. Whereas here, I had to focus a little bit more simply because the boards look a little bit more weathered. They've probably been there a while. These may be a couple of years old or even longer, but they're still not painted in a way that disguises them. And what gives it away is simply the shape of the boards. So I'm going to change the image now. I've circled all the different boards that I could see in this image. Maybe I missed some, but as you can see, there's several of them here. And again, this wasn't that hard to find. I know where people usually kind of set out stuff, and looking along walking trails on top of hills, this is really easy to find. So again, sorry if this is your board line and putting this out there like this. I tried to zoom in on both of these well enough so that there's no context clues for anybody else to find these, though if I could find these in about half an hour along with a couple others in the area, then I don't suppose it's that much harder for anybody else. So what can you do about this? Let's go ahead and get that image off the screen. So in that last example, those boards could be very easily disguised simply by painting black across them in a way that takes that large uniformly colored shape and breaks it up into many smaller shapes. And what you're doing with that is you're trying to mimic shadows cast by vegetation, grasses, that are around the board that you're setting out. Since we're trying to mimic the shadows cast by vegetation where we're putting the board, you want to take into account what that looks like on Google Earth. So if you've got grasses that are really tall, they're going to cast a much longer, larger shadow than if you have short grasses. So look at the satellite images of where you're going to be putting out your boards and see what that looks like. See what the grass and other vegetation looks like when it casts a shadow, nearby. Look for deer trails, look for walking trails, other things that can kind of give you an indication of what it's going to look like when you put your board out. So if you've got, really short grasses and you put a board out that's got really large looking shadows, it's going to stick out a lot more than if you painted some smaller shadows, maybe more numerous than what I do in my typical examples. So out here on the Gulf Coast, we've got grasses, 2 to 3 feet. They cast a fairly decent shadow when satellite images are taken. And as a result of that, I paint fairly large swaths of black across my boards. You also have to consider the color of the vegetation where you're setting your cover items. So if you live in an area that's really green most of the year, you're going to want to add some green paint to your boards before you set it out. If you live in an area that doesn't green up quite as much or has a lot less sparse vegetation, you can get away with either not adding any green to it or just adding it sparingly. With that in mind, I would imagine that if you've got, a board, especially a larger one, set out and it doesn't have any green on it, and it greens up for the year, and then, Google or whoever takes their satellite images, it's going to stick out a lot more if you've got a sea of green and you've got, a brown and black spot there, or at least several of them in a cluster. Because I live on the Gulf Coast, it's almost always got some level of greenery in satellite images, no matter what time of year they're taken. As a result, I paint my boards, how you see in the background here, I've got a mixture of green and black. There's fairly large swaths of black because the grasses do grow tall, and this seems to work pretty well around here. So all that said, it really depends on where you are planning on setting out your cover items as to what kind of paint job you should be putting on them. So you need to consider, is it a riparian area? Do I live in a place or am I setting this out in a place that's green most of the year? What is the height of the vegetation around it? And how can I mimic the shadows of that vegetation when satellite images are taken? So do a little bit of research, look at satellite images, even go back a couple of years. You can download Google Earth and you can go back into some historical satellite images, and that can give you an idea of what things look like at different times of the year and how best you can use that to your advantage when disguising your cover. One more point I want to make is that some people ask, well, why paint your boards when you can just simply take vegetation from around the board and set it on top? And I think there's really two things that kind of work against you with that. One of them is that vegetation can either blow away or it will deteriorate in a fairly short amount of time, so that board is then no longer covered. But additionally, if you put it on too thick, I think it creates kind of an insulated barrier that prevents sunlight from hitting the board and causing it to warm up to the point that makes it advantageous for snakes to get under. The last thing I'm going to talk about is the type of paint that I use and the tools that I use to apply it. So when I first started doing this, I used spray paint. I had a little case that I carried different colors of spray paint with, and then when I would go out and I'd set out stuff, I'd spray paint it right there. And it's really not a very cost-effective way of doing this. So what I've started doing more recently is I went to the hardware store and I got just a gallon of latex paint. So this is a exterior paint, and it's got primer in it as well, so it really quickly and easily adheres to the boards. I think this is about $20–25 per gallon, and I've used about this much of it so far, and I've put out a couple of dozen boards with that. So it goes a pretty long ways, but you do need a couple of extra things with that. And one of them is you're going to need a roller brush. So this brush was about $13, and I think the heads for this are like $2. Get whatever the cheapest head that you can find, because it's not going for anything important. It doesn't need to be painted super nice. And I keep reusing these. I just simply wrap them in plastic after I'm done, and then unwrap them and use them. And the last thing that you'll need if you're going to go this route is a paint tray. You can use the same one if you're using multiple different colors of paint. It really doesn't matter since they're all just going on boards that are sitting outside. So this is like $4. You can just get whatever cheap one that you can find and keep reusing it. So while going this route does cost a little bit more initially, in the long run it's going to save you a lot of money because then you're not constantly buying cans of spray paint, and this really paints a lot faster. I can put out about a dozen boards and I can get those done in about 10 minutes. So I would encourage you to go this route over spray paint and hopefully encourage you to actually paint your boards. Alright, that about wraps everything up that I wanted to talk about for this episode. If you have any questions, please feel free to comment down below. Be sure to like, subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next one.